the issues affecting Asia's animals and the stories of the people working on their behalf. We'll be taking you on a tour of what's been happening lately in the animal protection space around Asia and also bringing you updates from our huge network of animal protection organizations and our many working groups. Welcome to the Asia for Animals podcast.
Hello and welcome everyone to this special episode of the Asia for Animals Policy Podcast. I'm your host, Ngọc Anh Nguyễn, Lead Coordinator of the Policy Coalitions Working Group here. Today, we have a very unique opportunities to explore the world of international animal advocacy with a distinguished guest, David Peterson, from the World Federations for Animals. David, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ngọc Anh. It's my privilege and pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you with us today on the podcast. To start, could you introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners and share about your background? So what led you to the World Federations for Animals and what has been your focus since joining the organizations?
Yeah, thank you, Ngọc Anh. Well, as you mentioned, my name is David Peterson. I'm from Denmark. Originally, I'm based in Berlin. I did my sort of background in philosophy and got very interested in animal ethics and how we treat other species than ourselves, and saw there's a lot wrong with how we do that on a larger scale in our society, and decided something I wanted to dedicate my life to doing something around. And before joining the World Federation for Animals, I worked at a coalition called 50 by 40, which was a network of NGOs working on climate change, global health, animal welfare, and food justice, all working together to shift the world food system. And I think through that work, where it was quite a while, I really got a taste for an appetite for this collective work, and could sort of see both the joy, also the challenges of it, but how needed it is when you're sort of in the middle of that. You get the sense of it, like all your members are saying, wow, it's thank you so much for the support, that this has always been needed, but they've never had maybe capacity to step into that leading role themselves, or the support they needed. And yeah, so I got this taste for it, and after leaving 50 by 40, around a year later, this position opened up at the World Federation for Animals as the membership officer. And I just had the sense, wow, this is very well suited to me. I love this type of work. It's very linked, of course, to what I believe in personally. And my sort of work there is, as I sometimes call it, is to nurture the collective altruistic ambitions, meaning, how can we get people to support each other and sort of multiply the work we do, the impact of it by collaboration. So I'm very happy with the work I get to do every morning.
Thank you, David. It's super interesting to learn about your background in philosophy and how that aligns with your work at the World Federations for Animals. And thank you for the insightful introductions. Let's dive into the World Federations for Animals. Could you give us an overview of the organization's missions and vision? What was the inspirations behind establishing WFA in 2020, and how has its missions evolved over the past few years?
Yeah, thank you again. So the vision, as stated on our website, is a world in which animal sentience is respected and all animals live a good life with their well-being protected. So it's, of course, fairly broad, something that all our members and quite a few beyond can sort of sign up for, and it allows us this sort of big tent approach for all groups who agree with this message to join behind it. And we do so by curating and researching and sharing policy analysis and information, and then coordinating with our members to sort of act on this information and the opportunities that come from it. And then on behalf of our members, advocating for more unified messages and policy goals. And the sort of inspiration for that, I think this need for a more global coordination and a more unified voice came from the 20 leading animal advocacy organizations that came together. This also includes Asia for Animals, as you mentioned, in 2020. And they saw sort of a bit of a gap that there were already and are still like a lot of great groups that are doing great work in the global policy space for animals that both have the capacity and the expertise, Yet they also saw a need and an opportunity to have even more coordination and even more coordination sort of more formally between the groups that are already engaging in this, that would make their work more powerful. And also to give other groups across the globe, smaller organizations potentially that don't necessarily have the capacity or expertise to begin with, at least, give them access to also influence and to join their voice to the others. So this is also a way to sort of at the same time grow and also show the full strength of the global animal advocacy movement. And when you look at the United Nations, which is one of our key focus areas, the sort of global policy arena, when you sort of zoom back and think of it, the United Nations is kind of in the name. It's one of the humanity's biggest and most important set of collective goals, right? It includes the Paris Agreement, to combat climate change, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and much, much more. So all these goals are sort of hugely important for our own species, but we have so far not had very good representation of other species, all the other human animals in that work necessarily. And so they haven't really had a voice. And there's, I think, around, when you sort of count all of it, there's 100 something of UN agencies, UN bodies, and so on under the UN. There's even one for space exploration, but there's not a single one for animals, right? So these things are, when it comes to animal welfare, it's often discussed under the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, or other spaces such as the UNFCCC on climate change and how it relates to animals and biodiversity and so on. So there's not really a unified voice, and that's kind of what we aim to bring.
Yes, thank you, David. I could see that there's a lot of similarities between the Asia for Animals coalitions and WFA in terms of unifying the voices for our coalition's members. And it's super interesting to see how the WFA's built its visions and missions to tackle the gaps that has been missing in our collective movement. I would just like to further dive into how the organizations distinguish itself from other coalitions who is also working in the international advocacy space. So what sets WFA apart? What makes the organization's approach unique to you?
Yeah, thank you, Nagan. Well, you could say it from this point that WFA is also kind of in the name, the World Federation for Animals. It's sort of a very big tent. It's open to all types of organizations that works on all types of animals, all kinds of approaches to it. Whereas some coalitions are focused, or networks are focused on specific species or a specific group of animals or a specific policy forum, where WFA sort of is open to all groups working on all these and sort of trying to coordinate and maximize the synergies between that. So that's kind of the biggest strength of being this big umbrella. Of course, that's also often the biggest challenge. We often talk about cowherding the cats, right? All these different groups that have different goals and policies and that they sort of pursue. Yet at the same time, when you look at it, right, all these groups, when you get them to sit down, they agree on 90, if not 99%, although all the things that they want to happen, the sort of vision for the world with animals they see. So that's kind of what we focus on. And in terms of being sort of more distinct from other groups, it's not always that need to be so, because we collaborate across with all of them. And Asia for Animals is a great example, right, with a specific regional focus and so much in common in our approach and so on.
Yes, thank you, David, for explaining very well the approach, the unique approach that WFA has taken in order to fill the gap that is missing, and also take our collective advocacy on the global level to meet its full potential. I would like to talk a little bit more about the role of the regional networks, which I think is a very important part of the World Federation for Animals. So Asia for Animals is one of WFA's key regional networks, representing coalition members across Asia. From your perspective, David, why are regional networks like AFA, Eurogroup for Animals, or African Network for Animals Welfare, and others are crucial to WFA overall strategies?
Yeah, thank you, Nagan. It's a very long list. You could kind of see it in, let's say, if there's a sort of more functional approach, right? If They have all the regional all the knowledge, both on a region, on a national. They have the networks, they have the support of their members, and the sort of trust and all that. But for also, so that's sort of on a functional level. But from a movement level, it's you can't really build, let's say a big sort of umbrella without very solid foundations, that go all the way down. A good case, as I'm sure you're familiar with the UNEA Nexus resolution, where the 192 UN member states signed sort of One Health declaration, recognizing and acknowledging the importance of animal welfare as it relates to human health and environmental health. And this sort of, without getting into too much detail, but that started with an opportunity that the African Network for Animal Welfare got engaged with at UNEA, the headquarters in Kenya, and then joined in the World Federation for Animals with other members to sort of help lobby this, so it could both sort of be pushed from the sort of ground up, and the work that they were doing in the context they had an influence on the regional level, but also ensuring that other groups from across the globe came in and supported this important work. And I think that's a good sort of case that it can't just be done from upstairs, or let's say you can walk the halls of the UN headquarters in New York, but if you're not aware of, you don't have contacts across the globe to sort of actually know what's going on, or to have the contacts in the UN nation states or beyond even, right, to help get this work forward, then it's just not going to move, then it's just a lot of handshakes with people in suits somewhere far away. So a bit in the same way, I see like that it just couldn't be possible without, right? So we're very grateful to the work that groups like Asia for Animals and African Network for Animal Welfare, Red Lapa and CAWU and others are doing across the globe, because Eurogroup, of course, it's super important. Yeah, they're sort of the pillars that it all stands on, and there wouldn't be much without that.
Thank you, David. So in your experience, what are some of the key challenges when coordinating between multiple organizations, each with different priorities or regional focuses? How do you approach finding common ground to build unified advocacy strategies?
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite topics. There's this African proverb you probably heard. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And sometimes when working in coalition work, you kind of want to say, if you want to go slow, go together, right? It can feel like, we're spend a lot of time. And what do we get? We kind of just had a document signed that we agreed on, right? But then when you do zoom out, you see that these agreements and this coordination, this alignment of within our movement of the work is the foundation that we build, alignment with other movements, and that we ultimately go to policymakers instead of having 5 different asks or 7 different asks, right? We actually go with a unified, very solid approach, and very specifically go and target policy interventions. So you just see how strong it is when it's really been built together. So I think that also comes into answering the question, like how do we all do this work? It's the small little steps, and from that comes sort of the evidence, So people who worked in this, there's all often a lot of patience among them, and a recognition of how important and how powerful it is when you've done it, right? That's why you get so many groups signing up, especially those that worked a bit in a coalition before. Like, great that you guys are doing this work. Thank you so much for doing it, and they're happy to sort of chip in. So I think this sort of slow build up, having deliberate discussions where people, of course, there's a saying, if you want to be understood, then first seek to understand, right, where all these groups coming from, right, and getting on sort of a solid common footing around all these big issues. So aligning our wording and all that. And through that process, it starts sort of speeding up the work we can do, right? And they see the meaning of it. So I think that is really important. And of course, the research that is all built upon, right? That we use the same wording and refer to the same things. And you kind of see that already picking up with our members. I can imagine among yours as well, when there's already been a lot of great work being done before, alignment on key issues. Then it's much easier for the groups to get in and actually see, wow, okay, this is a solid piece of work that we can just get on with it.
Yes, thank you, David. So in your experience, in order to navigate the unique needs and differences between the regional networks? In the future, I'm just trying to articulate my questions here, David. My question is, how do you envision shaping your strategies working with the different regional networks and their members to align well with what WFA wants to see in the next 5 or 10 years? How do we try to, of course, in your answer, you have also explained quite well the strategies you are currently undertaking, but maybe down the line there could be more regional networks or more members joining WFA, and also these individual regional networks, and there could be a lot of changes in these overall strategies that WFA wants to take. How do you balance between these regional networks to create a fair and equitable and open space for the regional networks to represent their work? And so sort of like, how do you align your plans with the networks in the future?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I'd say key thing is taking time for communication, right? And sort of aligning, and communication not just being a one-way message, right? But creating spaces where there's opportunity feedback. So as you know, we've created these calls with representatives from the regional networks, where we sit in, it's often on a monthly basis, and discuss certain things on how we can increase communication, how can we increase the sort of workflows between the different regional networks, because they're, as you're aware, quite different. Much more similarity and unity in, vision, mission, and this sort of work, but of course regional differences and a lot of other things, capacity and so on. So yeah, I think that's the first step, is simply having a forum where there can be continuous feedback. Like we talked about earlier, if the sort of regional networks and their members are sort of the foundation that it all stands upon, right? It needs to be, how to say it, this needs to go both ways, the communication, right? So I think that's incredibly key. And in our the setup of our board, since our last and sort of first election we had back in May for our General Assembly, first time we sort of elected democratically our new board, there's specific regional seats reserved for the 6 regions from across the globe, right, to ensure that, so it's not a region that's not necessarily left out or doesn't have a seat at the table in that sense. And I think this is something that would be great to, how to say, make more sure. Like, so one thing is, of course, having one person from a member organization from each of these, but I think also expanding the membership. And as we've talked about before, I think one thing is, of course, just, allowing groups to join. Everyone is, of course, welcome to apply for membership, but also taking a bit more of time to listen to regions and groups from countries where we haven't had much contact before, and what are the key issues, what are the ways of communicating around there. Yeah, because I think so far there's still, certain overweight of groups from Northern Europe and beyond, and that's why the regional networks that represent so many groups and have all this contact and wealth of knowledge from these places are so important, to make sure that we get these perspectives. I hope that somewhat answers your question.
Yes, exactly. The reasons why I asked this question is for the audience out there to really understand the values of the regional networks to the WFA's overall strategies, and to really understand that, yes, there could be hundreds of organizations out there in each of the regional networks. Just like, for example, there are over 100 organizations within the Asia's Animals alone. And I want to shed light on how AFA could be this bridge between them and the WFA to make sure that their interests are represented, and that the WFA is taking a really interest and also serious approach to listening to the voices from all of these regions, and make sure it aligns well with the plans for the future. Yeah. So looking ahead, since we're talking about the future plans, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for the animal welfare movement globally in the next 5 to 10 years? So how is WFA positioning itself to capitalize on these opportunities, particularly through its work with regional networks? I think part of the questions has already been answered with the follow-up questions before, but maybe would be very interested to see what do you think will happen next in the long term?
Yeah, thank you. So for better or worse, I think the world is slowly waking up to the fact of how delicate the whole sort of balance, both of our ecosystems, and the latest pandemic was a good sign of that, right? That these things are all linked. It's like animal welfare or protecting biodiversity is not so much of a nice to have, right? Because it is in some way biodiversity is the immune system of our planet that we all live on. And you see this coming up more and more. It's not just, we shouldn't pollute because it's makes people in rural areas cough, right? It's a much bigger thing, and it has implications for human health in so many ways. So I do see sort of animal welfare slowly, not by itself, but sort of coming more into its right in the global policy space. Luckily, we have all the science on our side, right? If you look at the latest reports coming up from the IPCC and others, they always sort of state the same thing when it comes to food systems or One Health approach. Like we can't keep sort of ignoring this. And of course, it's good that we know that we have science on our side, but that's not necessarily enough. This needs to be communicated to policymakers at the right forums, the right venues at the right time, and of course also in the right language. And this is not sort of a work being done by one or two, three people, traveling across the globe to all these events. This is also done on the regional level and national events, and that's also how the whole UN structure works, right? There's a lot of sort of regional meetings, and this is also where the regional networks sort of can come in, and then we're sort of all aligned and coordinate our efforts and are quite, let's say, so strategic in dividing up the work, as we've also discussed on the regional calls, where how can we best make sure that the groups that have policy contacts already have good established networks can utilize these and also help build them in the long term. So other than that too, so that's kind of the reason why I think the regional networks is so important, right? In terms of sort of WFA positioning itself, it's also just sort of building not only sort of the knowledge base, but also setting up the let's say the policy infrastructure, you could call it, where, for example, with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right, it's a lot of the way that it's being talked about is excluding animals insofar, right? So there's still some kind of research that needs to link it more with animal welfare and how important it can be, and it can be a driver for sustainable development, not just sort of an extra price tag to add to it, right? So there we're in discussions around how can we co-develop this and how would we create something that fits in with the United Nations Sustainable Development Framework, right? So there's these sort of gaps in the policy landscape and the research behind it, and how do we create this together, because it cannot just be done by one person, and how do we make sure that it's disseminated to the right people?
Yes, thank you, David. So as you mentioned, with this increasing focus on issues like climate change and sustainable development, how do you see animal welfare fitting further into the broader international policy agenda, not just for the issues that I've just mentioned as example, but for potentially other topic as well? What shifts or trends are you noticing that could shape the future of this movement?
Well, that's also a good question. So like I mentioned earlier, the sort of science is there, but that's not always enough. Policymakers are busy, and it needs to sort of fit in with their existing narratives often. So what are some of the key emerging or existing narratives? There's more talk about the rights of nature, for example, to provide a legal rights and protection for nature in itself. Or this sort of valuation of nature, not just in terms of dollars, euros, or yen, but sort of describing it sort of a value in its own. And I think here it's important for the animal advocacy movement to be engaging in these discussions, working with a lot of the other types of groups that work around the UN system. So indigenous peoples, women's rights, farmers movements, because our issues are so linked with them, And here I think we could do a sort of increase our engagement with these groups. And yeah, I think there's also a role to play for the animal advocacy movement in terms of sort of opening up the engagement in global policy. So luckily a lot of members of WFA and ACF for Animals as well are quite good at communicating with the public and showing photos of animals and the issues. Yet I also think when it comes to the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, it's a very sort of complex system, and I think it's not for people, quote unquote, on the street. There's not that many that necessarily relate to them. So I think there's a way of making it relatable. So, and a big task in that. And my colleague Sylvia, who does amazing comms around this issue, she gave this great example of saying, 75% of the world's food systems depend on pollinators, which both includes bees as we know them, but other types of pollinators as well. We simply can't have a food system without pollinators, right? And I think this all of a sudden, at least for me, it kind of clicked, saying, wow, makes it very, very tangible, very relatable. I love food. I know we all need it. And I understand bees. I know somewhat of what a pollination process is. And it just made it very clear to me, like on an intuitive level, instead of this big lofty UN goal. I think there's something around, can we communicate this to people in a way that makes sense? There's also talks about, whales and other mammals of the sea that has huge carbon sequestration potential, right? They act as sort of carbon sinks, sort of on par with the forests of the world and all this. And I think these more clear images is something that we as a movement can do more to do and sort of put in the forefront for people to understand the urgency and the links between all of these, instead of just keeping it too abstract and science language.
Thank you, David. What I really like about your answer is that you managed to break down this complex, huge task into smaller details, easily digestible for the audience. So they really understand the language behind the scenes and what we're trying to do. And it doesn't sound like it's too complicated, when people just look at it in passing at the website. And maybe sometimes even when people hear the word policy, it feels like this huge insurmountable task. But you managed to break it down really well into smaller bits where people could understand what we're trying to do and why we're doing it, why we're approaching it the way we're doing it. Yeah. So David, on this note, I think it would be very interesting to learn about the next plan for WFA. Are there any exciting new initiatives or projects on the horizon that you would like to share with our listeners?
Absolutely. So we talked a bit about the animals in Sustainable Development Goals, so animal welfare being sort of included in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so this is a big sort of flagship project for us. It's sort of our strategy in the coming years. And I think because the UN Sustainable Development Goals is sort of goals that cuts across basically everything that the UN does, it provides us a good angle to engage with other movements and to sort of showcase the importance of animals across all these issues. So this is something, I think, beyond what it can do for animals to give them the spotlight that they need and deserve. I think it also becomes a way to engage with other movements we mentioned before. I think this is also really important to show that it's all very linked. And of course, a lot of this work is not just done in one policy stream or others. So this is work that we will, align with our work when you go to the UNFCCC, so the UN Convention on Climate Change, and other types of work, such as the UN Environmental Assembly. And I think it's kind of linking all our work and making sure that people can see how linked it is, so to speak. And as an example of this, we at this last week's COP29 in Baku, we launched our new tool. It's a website called Animals for Climate, which showcases a lot of policy solutions, progressive policy solutions that include animals. It can be around food systems, it can be around biodiversity protection, a lot of other things I urge people to go and check it out. And it shows what certain governments around the globe have already done when it comes to this. So it's a great tool for policymakers to see the benefits that they can have when they try to reach their own climate targets, and how actually including animals can be such a fast track to achieving their own goals, while of course at the same time treating animals better. So that's one tool I would like to highlight, and of course keeping an eye out on the sort of the ground, the work we're doing on the ground to build up a larger movement around the UN Sustainable Development Goals within the animal advocacy movements. So that's something I hope many more groups will join in on, because this, I think, are really, really good chance of doing a lot of good for animals and other movements as well.
Thank you, David. I think that the example that you just mentioned here sounds really like something that a lot of people can get on board with and contribute actively to. And it's, in my opinion, is a genius idea. First to present. To send to member state at COP, and also on the back end side of things, it's a great way to bring different perspective together and strengthen our narrative in a way. So we're very glad to be a part of the Animals for Climate tool earlier, and hopefully in the future I'll be able to collect more case study and contribute to that the online tool more. So how can member organizations of regional networks like AFA get more involved with WFA's work? Aside from what you've mentioned, of course, maybe something that you've envisioned more for the upcoming plans. In your opinion, what are the best ways for them to support the World Federation for Animals missions while staying connected through their regional coalitions?
So you mentioned a good concrete example of it, right? In the development of the Animals for Climate tool was, of course, done with and through our members, right, who have expertise in various different areas and who have contributed. And there are many of these processes in our working groups that work on specific issues or beyond all. It can also just be helping to amplify communication. So I think there's lots of different stages depending on capacity. Of course, there's something we're all mindful of in our movement. I think keeping your focus to what it is you do best is, of course, really, really important. At the same time, I think realizing how much of a multiplier that the collective work has, how it sort of helps us all. So I think it should be seen as a good investment, while of course being mindful of not burning out and taking on too much. So I think many different members of the different regional networks and WFA as well are on very different stages in terms of capacity or their focus. So the best first step, I would say, is starting to keep themselves, which many of them already are, more oriented around what global policy is, what it can do, how it's linked with animal welfare. And I think to sort of demystify that it's not this big, scary policy world, but it's actually very linked and it's very concrete things that they can be doing and engaging with. So I think that would be the first step, and from there sort of build up. And Asia for Animals has the wonderful policy coalition that you're heading up, and I think that's also a great way to join in, maybe just to first to learn, and then also start seeing, okay, how can they integrate this in their work? The UN Sustainable Development Goals, some of our members already integrating it, using it in their messaging, or even integrating it further. So I think it's just finding out kind of where you are and starting on the journey. And there's so many things you can be doing. So yeah, that's what I would say. And of course, again, being mindful of the capacity you have, the expertise you have, but also not being scared to engage in something new.
Thank you, David, for the great explanations. This is what I would envision for this episode, actually, for the audience, potentially AFA members and organizations out there who would like to join the AFA or the WFA to really understand the work that we're doing, and to know that even with the smallest contribution, it could make a big difference. So before we wrap up, David, I would love for you to share a message of hope with our listeners. Given the many challenges we face, what keeps you motivated in this work? And what would you say to those who might feel discouraged by the slow pace of progress in global animal welfare advocacy?
Yeah, it's a lovely way to end. So I'll share this story. When I started sort of my own advocacy back when I was a student, I helped start up the Meat Free Mondays in Denmark. So it's a campaign that works on getting universities and big canteens, restaurants, so on, to adopt one plant-based day in their canteen for animals, for the climate, and so on. And I remember as I was advocating for this, I was invited in to my first TV appearance in national TV in Denmark. And at a certain point, the journalist asks me, okay, yeah, so I think we get it, like it's important to shift towards more plant-based diets and so on for the climate and for the animals and all this. But what about, why are you then just advocating for 1 day a week? He said, isn't that just a drop in the ocean? And then I answered him, that is true, but actually the newest research shows that the ocean consists of nothing but drops. And I think it's, for me, kind of this reminder that, all the work we do, we might not, let's say, save all the animals or save all the rainforest or whatever our goal is, but that should not stop us from trying, and it should not stop us from acknowledging that we are actually doing something instead of nothing. And it means the world to those individuals we save. And it also has, I think, often much more impact than we actually get to try and quantify or understand ourselves. I've had people I've barely spoken to that I then met later on, and just out of a word or a conversation I had with, that had massive impact on them. And I know that's the case for me as well, having been very inspired, sometimes just by a video or a podcast or something that gave me motivation and a new way of thinking. So I think it's really important not to discount that. I think the biggest fuel that our movement runs on is hope, right? And then I think the best way to not run out of that fuel is to keep creating it and focusing on the people you have around you. Not always all the negative things that happen out there. We should be aware of it, but don't let it take away from the fuel you have. I think that's really, really important.
Thank you, David, for a very strong message to our audience. So if you could leave our audience with one more key takeaway from the importance of coalition work for advancing animal welfare, particularly through strong regional networks, what would it be?
I would say it like this, that I know it can be hard to, on top of your day job and the responsibility you of course have to achieve the goals of your own organization. Whatever sort of work you put into collective work through coalition work or others, it's an investment that comes back tenfold. There's a multiplier effect that is, it's hard to quantify, of course, but you just see it when you're in it. You can just see, okay, there's as they say, the rising tide lifts all boats. We're sort of lifting it all up together, which helps groups all across the globe. And I think this is not only really, really important, but it's also one of the only ways that we're going to achieve what we want to be doing, right? And a lot of the work that groups are doing already are, of course, linked into a larger issue. But I think that the coordination effort and all this work that Asia for Animals, among others, are doing is sort of a multiplier to the work of individual organizations. So look at it like an investment.
Thank you so much, David. I think that today's we've managed to cover a lot of ground in terms of what is happening behind the scenes, how regional networks contribute to the overall aims of the World Federations for Animals, and how each individual's member's voice can help make a difference, and all of the exciting plans in the next upcoming years. All the tools that we're currently developing as well. So, David, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I'm sure our listeners have gained a lot from these conversations. Do you want to share the final closing remarks for the audience before we close?
Just want to say thank you, Nogan, and thanks also just in personal capacity for the invitation and also all the work you do behind the scenes. I think, very happy to be working with you on Asia for Animals. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David. And for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more about the World Federations for Animals and how you can support this important work, please visit their website. And remember, by working through strong coalitions like Asia for Animals and World Federations for Animals, we can amplify our impact and create a better future for animals. And thank you so much to all of you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the Asia for Animals Policy Podcast. Goodbye, and until next time, stay focused and continue to fight for the voiceless. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. You can find everything you need to know about our work and connect with us at asiaforanimals.com. Tune in for the next episode. Asia for Animals Coalition, a united voice for Asia's animals.